Greetings, friends and brethren. This is Frederick Woods of the Continuing Church of God. And today I've been asked to bring you an update of a small project I worked on for a new friend of ours in church, Mr. Carlos Aponte, who is an important representative in the Puerto Rico congregation of the Continuing Church of God. And before I begin, here's a spoiler alert. Since I never went through our Church of Spokesman Club training back in the day, which trained the fellas to speak off the cuff, spontaneous, I'd like to use my mini teleprompter here. You've all seen Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden using those towery teleprompters off to the side. So I'm going to use this one. And like I was saying, I worked on a small project for Mr. Aponte of God's Church in Puerto Rico, which I finished for him a couple weeks back. Mr. Aponte recently had a 16-page, internet-based machine translation of one of our overseer, Pastor Dr. Bob Thiel's YouTube sermons. And he wanted it printed out into error-free English text. I have a feeling it will also get retranslated into Spanish now, too. The topic on that sermon is regarding many of our relatives and friends who have passed on for now. They're in the grave and waiting for an eventual glorious resurrection, spoken of in Ezekiel 37. That translation for Mr. Aponte, it covers the true resurrection in Ezekiel, Isaiah, Revelation, and Matthew. You can learn those details covered in the YouTube from Pastor Dr. Thiel online sermon. Well, it would be nice to have that message in Spanish eventually for Puerto Rico or any other group worldwide who speaks and writes Spanish. So for now, I have helped by correcting many errors in the machine translation for English in that file so that Mr. Aponte can now translate it into Spanish easier. And to give you a short background of how I came to be acquainted with Mr. Aponte and his need that he shared with me about the short translating project I recently finished for him. This summer, I receive, along with all the brethren and co-workers of the Continuing Church of God, I receive every Thursday the weekly Letter to the Brethren email from Pastor Dr. Thiel's Grover Beach office, headquarters. In that weekly message that we all look forward to every Thursday, many bulletins of church activity and worldwide church activity, needs, prayer needs, spiritual advice, and lessons, and general updates on our collective Christian duty are all packed into that weekly Letter to the Brethren. Well, this summer, Pastor Dr. Thiel lightly touched on the subject of our new friend, Mr. Aponte in Puerto Rico. And upon reading about that, off the top of my head that day, it suddenly kicked off remembering a similar idea I had about 30 years ago when I was in the old worldwide Church of God. 30 years ago, in the 1990s, our worldwide Church of God was really huge and worldwide, like we are now spreading out to be here also in Continuing Church of God. Back then, the pastor general at the time, he still had regional pastors who were sort of like a New Testament bishop maybe, who would basically be somewhat of a leader of an entire world region. Like for instance, we had a Caribbean regional pastor, a North American or a South American regional pastor, a European areas regional pastor, Southeast Asian, and Central Asia. And I forget all the actual regions in our old worldwide news bulletins. Back then I did something similar to what I just did here with Mr. Aponte. Back then, off the top of my head, I up and wrote a short introductory letter to our Worldwide Church of God's Caribbean Regional Director. And I wish I could remember his name, but it could very well ring a bell if I researched a little back into the web's archives. So I wrote that intro letter back then to the WCG Caribbean Regional Director. I had a general light interest of how our Haitian brethren were doing at the time. I had been to a few U.S. Feast of Tabernacles back then as a young guy in my 20s, and I was accustomed to seeing our richly blessed American brethren attending God's feasts and, of course, spending their second tithe as commanded by God to richly enjoy a sometimes huge, fantastic American-style feast. Kind of luxurious compared to poorer regions of our same church brethren, say down there in Haiti. Some things are still the same in some ways, but I wrote to that Caribbean regional pastor asking him if he'd introduce me through what was known back then as postal service letter writing or snail mail, asking him if he'd introduce me by way of the mail to any Haitian members or co-workers. I felt blessed when the regional pastor did write me back. It was when I was living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1995, in a really nice shared apartment with a good-natured roommate I had at the time, Bill Kennedy. It was on Humboldt Avenue, not too far from Brady Street. I had just learned a new skill, which provided me the best income I ever had at the time, school bus driving. American school bus driving. I had almost no expenses. I rode the Milwaukee City bus and rode my bike instead of using my van, which I just kept parked basically. And I was saving up a pretty decent savings account. And I felt so blessed. So somehow it developed an interest in me at the time to become concerned for our Haitian brethren, who were typically burdened with really tough living conditions. Well, that regional pastor at our Worldwide Church of God at that time, he wrote me back telling me I could write a fella in Haiti. And I do remember the Haitian fella's French name, a French spelling. It was Mr. Yvel Virgin, Y-V-E-L, Yvel Virgin. He was either in God's church or a co-worker. Mr. Yvel Virgin at that time, he seemed to be single, and indeed, me and Mr. Yvel Virgin began writing mail. It was, I believe, always airmail stamps we had to get. It was pretty timely, as I recall. The postal service of both countries, ours and his in Haiti, were pretty decent even then about not having to wait too long for our mutual shared correspondence. Eventually, Mr. Virgin told me about his private school project for youths, and to this day I distinctly remember the name of Mr. Virgin's Haitian school. The initials, anyway, were A-R-A-E-D-D. I think it was in Port-au-Prince or nearby. And it was known as École, A-R-A-E-D-D in French, the French word for school. He sent me photos of the lady teacher running the school, built in white stucco maybe. And it looked a little bit like if you've ever seen Oprah Winfrey's school that she has for kids across overseas. And for many months, me and Mr. Yvel Virgin corresponded about his school, and we also discussed a little about a dangerous situation back then, the Tontons Macoutes, a dangerous Haitian government militia or warlord group, which seems to have been abolished now since 1994, thankfully. And if Mr. Virgin is still around, and he happens to come across any of these YouTubes online all these years later, I'd like to offer him the same hope I found in 2013, when I first saw Pastor Dr. Thiel's new Philadelphian work here, continuing at the Continuing Church of God. The hope that God's church may have been hard to find for a while back then, when we were writing letters and sort of knew each other there in 1995, but that God would provide a way, even now, and raise up an honorable and brave new overseer who we've come to appreciate in our pastor, Dr. Bob Teal. A very brave fellow indeed. He stood up to serious errors committed in some of our previous Church of Gods that we've all came out of, including the Mr. Takash Sr. errors and subsequently other leaders too. God is showing us more answers for the puzzling questions we had back then about place of safety, Daniel 9:27, and the nation with the strongest fortresses being clearly how the Bible identifies the USA, if one has eyes to see. And we are learning interesting details of the Cenacle building near the traditional King David's tomb site. And additionally, we have a wise elder over in Serbia, Alexander Sasha-Vage, has revealing lessons that the world has skipped. Like the one concerning Prophet Jeremiah bringing a lady named Tia Tefi, a princess of Israel, over to Ireland, which kept the King David line alive and well to this day, right on the British throne. And this year, when our current overseer of God's church, Pastor Teal, began mentioning to us in the letter to the brethren about Mr. Aponte in Puerto Rico, well, guess what? I got inspired all over again to email Mr. Aponte, just like I did back in the old Worldwide Church of God when I wrote postal mail to the Caribbean regional pastor. And when I wrote Mr. Aponte of Puerto Rico this summer, he emailed me back, and I could see the unfortunate way machine-translated sermons end up coming out as the finished product. I was surprised that the machine translator did quite a good job overall on some really vague and obscure spoken details with our American speech mannerisms. But in general, a lot of stuff, even names of scriptures and Hebrew terms, or just late mannerisms we use in speech, they come out looking like a totally different language. So Mr. Aponte asked me to clear up the numerous errors printed out on the machine-translated text from Pastor Dr. Teal's last Great Day sermon. And I used my smartphone to do it. I got Microsoft Word and Big Buttons keyboard, and I used my reading glasses. And I was able to clear up all the gibberish left over on an otherwise really impressive job the machine translator does do. Perhaps the biggest reason I don't much use a desktop or laptop often is because the smartphone needs no Wi-Fi and no cable subscription. So that's why I did it on this little thing. And I'll show you some examples I remember that I had to clear up from the machine translator errors. For Shemini Azeret, a Hebrew term, it just had a wild spelling, and I cleared that up. Also, a lot of times, the word N-O would be spelled K-N-O-W, no. And sometimes wheel, like we will, would be translated like a wheel, W-H-E-E-L. And you can find the video of that sermon on the Continuing Church of God YouTube channel. Its title is Last Great Day, God is Impartial, and He has a Plan for All. I believe it's dated 2019, and to date it has about 360 views. So overall, brethren, this project I got involved in for Mr. Aponte and for God and our church shows you that God has lots of ways we can serve. Whether it's sending in the vital tithes to headquarters, or also with praying, maybe with special music, the hymns, and of course the speakers and other leaders and officials in the church leadership bringing us the full sermons. Many ways to help out and show God we love Him and appreciate His blessings. And if we're not careful, we can lean too far into asking church or God for help, or trying to get stuff at times. So make sure we never treat God like He's a vending machine, and never treat Him like He's a butler, or a Downton Abbey footman, just because we get used to him providing huge blessings many times over. But in closing, I actually intend to sort of paraphrase the late President JFK, and I'm going to kind of reword what he said about serving country to be rerouted a little toward church, really. Here goes. Ask not what your Church of God can do for you. Ask what you can do for your Church of God. This has been Frederick Woods for the Continuing Church of God.